Join together in prayer. Lord, we thank you for this beautiful fall morning in which we can gather together and worship of you. We thank you for the reassurance that even in the midst of the storms that surround us, that perhaps at times come up suddenly, that you assure us that even in the midst of those times, that you are in control, that you are guiding us, that you are our Messiah. In Jesus' name. I've come to realize this is probably pretty common for a lot of people, but I didn't realize that at the time. As I was going through middle school, I came to a point in which I was feeling very uncertain about my identity. I was raising these questions about who I really am and what God really wanted me to do, where God was leading me. I tried to be a good friend and a good person. I tried to do very well in all that I was doing, whether it be academics or orchestra or soccer. And I tried to fit in with those who were around me. But truth be told, I didn't really fit in all that well with my peers. And while I did fairly well with my schoolwork, I was only mediocre at best when it came to things like soccer and orchestra. And no matter how hard I tried, it just seemed that I didn't really fit in with the people around me. And I began wrestling more with that, and I remember there was a song actually that I listened to quite a bit at that time on an album that actually asked these questions of who am I? Where am I? Why do I feel this way? And I found myself wrestling so much with these questions about my identity that I actually began to experience this in my dreams as well. I had this recurring dream in which I would be in this classroom and something would happen that I knew I hadn't done, but everyone thought that I had done. And I kept thinking, they know me, they should know that I wouldn't do this. And at another point in the dream, there was a person who I didn't recognize who asked me, "Who are you?" And I drew a complete blank. I had no idea. I didn't have the first place to start in answering the question, who I am. I just said, I don't know. Which brings us to this passage for this morning. Jesus invited his disciples to go to the other side of the lake. And on their way, while he was sleeping, a storm came up, and the waves began to roll, and the wind was blowing, and it looked like the ship was surely going to sink, that they were all going to drown. And so they went to Jesus, and they told him, "We're going to drown." Jesus got up. He commanded the waves, he commanded the winds to be calm. He calmed the storms, and then he asked them, "Where is your faith?" And in fear and amazement, they asked each other, "Who is this?" That he commands the winds and the waves, and they obey him. Within the story, it seems to me, have a number of lessons that are pertinent to us. The first one being that Jesus is our guide. It's interesting to me that in the midst of this story, it was Jesus' suggestion, let's cross the lake right now. Let's go across the lake. He's the one who gave that idea. He's the one who led them in that direction. Now, certainly storms do come up rather suddenly on the Sea of Galilee. But we would think that as Jesus boarded that boat, that he knew that a storm was coming. And we can imagine that as he laid down to sleep peacefully, that he knew that things were about to get rough. But even in the midst of that, he led them out onto that water. And I wonder how often we are struck with that reality ourselves. That when we come to a difficult time, we start asking the questions of why, God? Why is this happening? Or perhaps worse, why are you doing this to me? We ask these questions that have more of a victim mentality of I'm the one who's suffering and why is this happening to me? When I wonder if instead the question isn't so much about why, but rather the question is about what. If God did lead, if Jesus did lead the disciples into this storm, if God does sometimes lead us through difficult and challenging things in our lives that he could completely avoid and get rid of, but chooses not to, then what is it that God is trying to do in the midst of these circumstances? What kingdom purpose does God have for going through this time? We live in a fallen world. There's pain, there's suffering, there's death all around. And we wonder why God doesn't take it away. But perhaps the times that we do suffer through actually have a greater kingdom purpose in mind that God intends to use for a better and good thing. Jesus is our guide. Jesus also calms the storm. In the midst of this storm, he was peaceful. He was calm. He was sleeping. But when the disciples got worried and they became nervous, when they thought they were going to die, Jesus rose and woke up and calmed the storm, calmed the waves, calmed the wind. So what was the purpose of it? And it wasn't to harm the disciples. They had no injury. This wasn't a punishment for them for anything that they had done. Perhaps this was an exercise, an opportunity to practice going to Jesus with their concerns. They had no power to control the wind and the waves. Certainly in the midst of this storm, they weren't going to be able to get the boat back to safety. But they were able to take their fear, to take their concern to Jesus. Or perhaps this was an opportunity for them to practice trust in God's leading. Jesus had led them into these waters. He had led them into these waters and he went to sleep. And yet when this storm came up and he wasn't bothered by it, they were terrified. They were fearful. They were uncertain of what this really meant for them. They thought this might mean their death. But instead, this was an opportunity to trust in God, to trust in his leading, to trust in his protection. For some of us, I can imagine that this last week has been a bit stormy, that it's seemed like our moorings have shaken loose, that the floor is a bit unsettled, that things that we counted on as being sure for a time are no longer quite so sure. But even in the midst of those storms that we encounter, those uncertainties, those challenging times, we know that Jesus is our guide, and we know that Jesus is able to calm the storm. But perhaps the biggest reason for this encounter of the storm was actually to answer a question. At the end, after Jesus had calmed the storm, in fear and amazement, the disciples asked, "Who is this? That even he can command the wind and the waves and they obey him." Who is this? As we follow on the rest of chapter 8, we see that there are several answers to that question of who this is. Of course, first of all, we've already seen that Jesus is the one who is able to control and command even the elements of earth, the wind, the waves. Jesus is able to control that which the Creator created. But in the next segment, he comes to the territory, the region of the Gerasenes. And while he's there, this man who is demon-possessed comes up to him in a rant. And we see that Jesus is also able to control the demons, to control the spiritual realities. Jesus casts those demons out into the pigs, and they commit swinecide. All right. Actually, when I was in Jerusalem, over in Israel, we went and visited that site, and there was a church that's been built there, and we nicknamed it the Church of the Running Pigs. Jesus is able not only to control the elements of earth, the wind and the waves, he is also able to control the demons, the spiritual realities of the world. And after that, we see that he's also able to bring healing and even raise the dead to life. Because after the time in the Gerasenes, he comes back, and a man named Jairus comes and tells him of how his daughter, his 12-year-old daughter, is sick and about to die. As Jesus is going to heal this girl, a woman comes up to him and touches him. And just by touching his cloak, is healed of bleeding for 12 years that no one had been able to help her with to cure her from. After she is cured, the news comes that this daughter has died and that Jesus need not be bothered anymore. But Jesus still goes. He goes to the house of Jairus, and he raises this girl from the dead. Who is this? This is the one who is able to control the wind and the waves. This is the one who is able to control the demons and the spiritual world. This is the one who is able to heal and bring the dead back to life. And in chapter 9, we see that after the event of the sending out of the 70 and the feeding of the 5,000, it's the very question that Jesus asks. He talks to his disciples and he says, "Who is it that the crowds say that I am?" Well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say some other prophet of long ago who's come back to life. Then Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" And it's at that point that Peter declares God's Messiah. That's who this is. Which brings me back to my questions about my identity and my struggles in middle school. I didn't quite know who I was at the time. I was testing out possibilities, and I began to realize that people's perceptions of me didn't necessarily define who I was. Because they could choose to perceive me in ways that were completely unfair and unrealistic. It wasn't about what people thought of me. And even though I did well in school, it wasn't about my grades or my achievements. Those could quickly fall away, or even in some cases, those became barriers to relating to some people. It probably helped that around this time I was taking a class at my church to become a member. A class in which we learned more about who Jesus was and what it meant to be a follower. And through that dream that I had, I actually came to realize that it's not just about who Jesus is, but it's also about who I am in Jesus. My identity is based on my relationship to Christ. Who I am flows out of who Jesus is. 1 Corinthians 3:11 tells us that no one can lay any foundation but that which is already laid in Jesus Christ. That is the foundation for my identity, for our identity as a people. It seems fitting to me that we consider this morning on a day in which we're welcoming new members into the congregation. For some of us, we may question whether membership still really serves a purpose anymore. After all, we have some members who we haven't seen for quite a long time. We have others who are not members but incredibly active here in our congregation. What purpose does that membership serve? Well, I think at least one thing that it serves comes out of these questions that I'll be asking KJ and Larry. Because I think that they're important questions of identity. First, having previously made confession of your faith and been participants of Christ's church, do you now reaffirm your baptismal vows and your faith in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior? It's an identity question. Second one, as you willingly unite with this church, do you commit yourselves to ongoing growth in faith as you continue your journey of discipleship following the way of Christ? And thirdly, do you commit yourselves to active participation in the life and work of the congregation, including regular worship, the offering of your gifts, and the giving and receiving of counsel? To me, these are questions of identity. They're questions that affirm our identity in Christ. They're questions that affirm our identity in the journey that we are along of discipleship. They're questions that affirm our identity in the midst of this local community, this body of believers. And while the focus today for membership may be primarily on KJ and Larry because they're making that commitment, I'd invite us this morning, each one of us, to consider, who is this? Who is this Jesus that we've encountered? How does knowing that shape my own identity and who I am? And how does being a part of this particular body, this particular expression of community and Christian faith shape who I am? Amen.
WBTL, we believe in love.